Russians arrived in Ukraine's southern port city of Kherson a few days ago. Today, the mayor here says Russian soldiers have taken over the local government building. He said the occupiers had imposed a nighttime curfew and said people can only go out in twos during the day. The mayor said he'd appealed to Russian soldiers not to shoot people. The US says we don't know yet whether this strategic city has become the first to fall to Russian forces. But both the White House and the British Ministry of Defence say the Russian march on Kyiv has, for now, fallen short. These armoured vehicles are in Bucha, around 25 kilometres outside the city centre.
The northern push by the Russians down towards the south, towards Kyiv, remains stalled. They haven't, from our best estimates, have not made any appreciable progress, geographically speaking, in the last 24 to 36 hours.
As the war enters its second week, Russia revealed how many of its troops have been killed.
Unfortunately, there are losses among our comrades participating in this special military operation. 498 Russian servicemen died in the line of duty. All possible assistance is being provided to the families of the deceased. 1,597 of our comrades were wounded.
Neither side's figures on troop casualties can be independently verified, but the Ukrainian president claimed his forces have killed nearly 9,000 Russian troops and had this message for Vladimir Putin's men.
Ukraine doesn't want to be covered by the dead bodies of soldiers. Go home with your whole army. Tell your officers that you want to live, that you don't want to die, but to live. We need to stop the war and restore peace as soon as possible.
Ukraine has not released a casualty figure for its armed forces, but the UN says 136 civilians have died. Ukraine says, in fact, 2,000 have been killed. This building in Irpin on Kyiv's northern edge was shelled at 7:30 in the morning.
We're hiding in the basement, and in the morning we were hit. We left as we were. We just brought our documents with us. We don't have anything else with us.
Russian forces are closing in on Ukraine's second city, Kharkiv, in the north, and in the south, Mariupol. The council here says troops have deliberately taken out civilian infrastructure, leaving people without power or water. It says the city is near to a humanitarian catastrophe. This morning, the British Foreign Secretary, meeting the foreign ministers of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, welcomed the opening of an investigation into possible war crimes by the International Criminal Court.
We must ensure Putin fails in this horrific enterprise and his ambitions go no further. We were pleased to support Lithuania's leadership, referring war crimes to the ICC.
Ukraine is waking up to a second week at war with Russia. Its soldiers and armed civilians have frustrated Vladimir Putin's plans, but the attacks on targets like Kyiv are intensifying. Peace talks are due again today, but Ukraine says Russia must stop bombing cities before any progress can be made.
Jane Deeth with that report. Now, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has said that Western leaders are preparing for war against Russia and that Moscow would press on with military action in Ukraine until the end. Channel 4 News was the only British broadcaster to be given access to the video-linked press conference which Mr. Lavrov gave this morning. Cathy Newman quizzed him on civilian casualties and the launch of the war crimes investigation by the International Criminal Court. Listen.
Mr. Lavrov, I want to ask you about Polina Zapadinskaya. She was in her final year of primary school. She was shot dead by the Russians as she was in her family car in Kyiv on Saturday. Mr. Lavrov, I know you have a daughter yourself. I want you to look me in the eye and just tell me, how do you sleep at night knowing that Russian bombs and bullets are killing children?
Могу сказать дополнительно к тому, что я уже сказал. So what can I say in addition to what I've said already? Any human life is priceless. Any military actions are unfortunately connected to human loss, not just amongst the military personnel, but amongst the civilians. Our military personnel who are now involved in this special operation have a very strict order to only use high-precision military equipment to suppress the military infrastructure. Even the barracks where the Ukrainian army resides are not subject to any attacks. I can only express my condolences.
But you say Mr. Lavrov, you say high precision is used, but hundreds of civilians have reportedly already died. This is now being investigated by the International Criminal Court. I wonder if you personally are preparing your defense in a war crimes tribunal.
I understand your desire to ask such heated questions as you want to emotionally charge your audience. This is your job, as far as I understand, to function as mass media, but rather as an instrument for hammering into people's head the information that is required by the Western leaders. I want to say once again, I am not justifying any action that leads to the death of civilians. But we were not the ones who came up with the expression of collateral damage. It was coined by our Western colleagues during their escapades in Iraq and previously in other countries, Latin America, Libya. Have you once used the same emotional charge covering the events in Iraq and Libya when there were hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties? I can't recall. So I see that your question is a rhetorical one.
Yes, absolutely, Mr. Lavrov, I have. But this is, you started this war. Polina's blood is on your hands, isn't it, Mr. Lavrov?
You are now playing a game and acting like a talk show host. If you want to know my personal opinion, I believe I have already expressed it very clearly, including the humanitarian aspects of the current operation. But I would really like you to, though I understand you will be covering it the way you're required to. But I really want you to bear in mind, and I hope that a journalist who is fulfilling a brief has a conscience, how you have conducted yourselves for the last 8 years, when girls just like that one, along with women and the elderly, were killed by thousands of mines in the Donbass. They were killed by the Ukrainian regime. Please visit the website of our ministry for more information, as I don't want to take up your time with long stories. If you are that concerned, as you are right to be, of the humanitarian consequence of any military operations, then God is willing for you to look at those pages which you have so far preferred not to touch on in your professional role.
Now, Ed Arnold is an analyst from the defence and security think tank RUSI, and he joins me now from London. Ed, it's good to speak to you. There's a very lively debate going on here amongst security analysts and military boffins about whether the Russians are doing well in this campaign, if that's the right word to use, or whether they're actually falling behind. Where do you stand on this, looking at the overall picture?
Overall, I think you have to look at phase one of operations from the initial invasion on Thursday till around Monday evening, when we saw the tactics change. In phase one, the Russian military have underperformed badly against expectations, and it really is a complete failure to plan for this type of operation. Multiple things have gone wrong at the operational and tactical levels. Although we're seeing now a change in tactic as of Monday, which is the heavier use of artillery and firepower and heavier use of forces, the difficulty is that the operational troops can change tactics and adapt relatively quickly. The logistics can't, and we're still seeing the problems of logistics that are really hampering Russian advances in the northeast and south of the country.
I mean, I've always been told that the Russian military playbook is one of different stages. Stage one may not have gone according to plan, which is why stage two, the pummeling of big cities, is now kicking in. But when you look at what they're doing in the south of the country especially, things seem to be moving in their direction there, don't they?
Yeah, so to cover the south first, the advance has been far quicker and less hampered by the logistical issues. If we look and see what they've already achieved, they have control of Donetsk and Luhansk, although that is contested at the moment. They now have a land corridor from Crimea to Russia. They have taken Kherson in the south, and they are also moving that. So they are also to the west of the Dnieper River now, which gives some options. However, I see that while the military objectives seem relatively clear now in terms of targeting the population centers and using traditional Russian doctrine, the political objectives are now getting wider and wider because, taking Kharkiv, for example, that was a population center which was actually relatively pro-Russian, not anymore. So the more brutal that the military measures become on the ground, the less chance of some form of political victory for Putin.
Right. Ed, why are we not seeing more Russian air power? Because, it was always said the Russian Air Force is much superior to the Ukrainian one. We've really not seen either side using their Air Force very much at all.
Yeah, so from the Russian perspective, it is actually a little bit of a mystery. The initial invasion started with long-range precision fires to take out some Ukrainian air defense and essentially to blind their Air Force, striking runways and taking out radar, but then it wasn't followed up while the Ukrainian Air Force was vulnerable, and that has severely hampered phase one operations. I mean, there's multiple factors to that, ranging from low levels of confidence within the Air Force, very poor ground to communications, even down to a lack of precision-guided munitions. On the Ukrainian side, we have seen some effective use of the Air Force, and the fact that the Air Force is still operating 7 days into this conflict is remarkable. There are some drones on some logistics convoys. However, I think the Ukrainian Air Force really do need to protect what little assets they have left in case they want to counterattack or break out from one of the cities. They will need that air power at some point in the future.
Finally and briefly, Ed, if I may, is it still possible for the Russians to achieve one of the possible goals of partition of Ukraine? They take the east of the country, everything from the Dnieper River to the Russian border, and they leave the west as a kind of rump Ukraine.
Yes, potentially. I think the operations have gone so badly for the Russians that they actually need probably a protracted tactical pause, which will then allow them to reset, sort out their logistics issues. So it kind of gives them a good opportunity to encircle the population centres, move to a position of strength, probably around on the Dnieper River, and then have some form of dialogue and allow them to reset and then potentially move on to a larger phase country.
Ed Arnold from RUSI, thank you very much indeed for joining us. The other big story, the human story, of course, is the massive exodus of refugees from this country. Over 1 million now in the first 7-8 days of fighting. That is quite extraordinary. Let's speak to Shabia Mantouf from the United Nations Refugee Agency. She joins me now from Geneva. Shabia, thanks for coming on the program. The numbers are staggering, aren't they?
Indeed, this is a major refugee situation where we're seeing so many people really having to flee their homes on foot, by car, and we're seeing this has happened in the space of just 7 days. So 1 million Ukrainian refugees have now been forced to flee their homes across the region.
And as the cities like Kharkiv and Kyiv get pummeled, that number will just increase, won't it?
Well, we're seeing these increases happen minute by minute, hour by hour. In some locations at the borders, they're queues for up to 60 hours. So we're expecting a steady stream of arrivals to those neighboring countries. So as in the absence of peace, we will continue to see more and more people be forced to flee their homes. Their lives drastically change because of the conflict. And while the reception and the solidarity in those neighboring countries has been really encouraging and overwhelming, in fact, it doesn't really substitute for the fact that these people have been driven from their homes.
I mean, after years of the civil war in Syria, we saw 1.5 million, mainly Syrian refugees arriving in Europe. That was an overwhelming number. And politically, it was very contentious for many countries, including Germany, to take in that many people. Here, we're seeing 1 million in a week, and we might go up to, what, 4 or 5 million at the end of all this? We just don't know. Do you think Europe is ready for what's coming?
Well, our estimates were that we could be prepared to see up to 4 million refugees having to flee the country, and this can happen in the coming period, maybe in a couple of weeks or who knows. But we also have to remember that there are people inside Ukraine as well that are also being forced to flee their homes, and they're displaced around the country. So we're dealing with a massive exodus of people inside and outside the country, and the main thing is now to continue the access to territory, that borders should remain open. People should be able to seek that safety and protection, but it does require a coordinated and really a supported response. So we have launched appeals to support those neighbouring countries, but really more support and solidarity is also required from the rest of the region.
I mean, I wonder if there are plans in place for accommodating 4 million people across Europe. Have you had these conversations with governments? Are there any ideas of how many people are being, welcomed into how many different countries?
Well, as I mentioned, the response has been overwhelming. So the 1 million refugees have been absorbed by those local communities. National authorities have made sure the borders are open so people can cross and they can seek safety. They've been received on arrival. Some are being hosted in transit or reception facilities. Members of the public are just opening their homes and their hearts to host these people. And others are even being put up in hotels being paid for by private companies. So the reception has just been phenomenal, and we really encourage that spirit of empathy, that compassion to continue. But unfortunately, in the absence of peace, we do expect more and more to filter through.
And just very briefly, Shabir, are the border crossings now down the road from here to Poland, Slovakia and Hungary, are they now more organized, or is it still chaos?
Well, the borders have remained open, so people are coming steadily. It's just that there is just such a big movement of people, so it does take time. People are waiting in long queues in some areas, but in other countries, those queues are less so. So it really does depend across those different countries, but it is a steady stream of arrivals.
Okay, got to leave it there. Shabir Mantou, thank you very much for joining us there from the UNHCR in Geneva. Fatima, over to you.
Thanks, Matt. Now, athletes from Russia and Belarus will be banned from the Beijing Paralympic Winter Games after all. The International Paralympic Committee said yesterday that they would be allowed to compete under a neutral flag. But this morning, the IPC overturned that decision with the opening ceremony just a day away. Well, our sports reporter Jordan Jarrett Bryan is here for us to explain what's going on. Jordan, what's prompted the U-turn?
Well, yeah, as you mentioned there, the International Paralympic Committee have eventually fallen in line with other global sporting federations in banning all Russian and Belarusian athletes from the Winter Paralympic Games. This comes after they announced just yesterday, as you mentioned also there, that they would be allowing those athletes to compete, but under a neutral flag. Now, this morning, they've said to us in a statement, Andrew Parsons, the IPC president, two reasons for this. First of all, the security and safety of all the athletes at the village there was their primary concern. They had serious concerns about the safety of all the athletes at the village. And secondly, the number of athletes who were concerned and frustrated and even angry about the competition allowing Russia to take part, they wasn't having it at all. And I've been in contact with some of the athletes there who have said there were athletes that were even considering boycotting the games if the IPC didn't reverse this decision. So they had no choice really other than to ban those athletes from these games. There's about 83 Belarusian and Russian athletes who will be expelled and sent home tonight. But speaking again, some of those athletes who are competing there, they are much more happy with the IPC that they have eventually come to this decision. Elsewhere in sport, in football, the Russian billionaire owner, Roman Abramovich, has said that he will be selling Chelsea Football Club. It's only on the weekend, on Saturday, that he announced that the control would be deferred to Chelsea's foundation trustees. But he has now said that he will be selling the football club, and also that any loans to be repaid, he will be foregoing those, and so proceeds from the sale will be donated to any war victims.
Thanks very much, Jordan. Well, the super yacht owned by one of Russia's richest businessmen has been seized in the German port of Hamburg. Another yacht in France has also been held. The seizures provide evidence that Europe is getting tougher in its pursuit of Russian oligarchs, and it will increase the scrutiny on whether the UK government is doing enough. Well, our economics correspondent Helia Ibrahimi is here. Helia.
Well, Fatima, there's increasing pressure, as you said, on the UK government to step up its sanctions against Russian oligarchs. The Foreign Office is providing a long list of names that are apparently sanctioned. But when you look closer, many of those names are MPs that are in the Duma who don't necessarily have assets here and are certainly not going to travel to the UK in the middle of a war. People that do have assets, people like Alisher Usmanov, Mikhail Friedman and Peter Arvin, have been targeted by the EU, but are not on the UK list of sanctions, and of course Roman Abramovich. In fact, the EU has been doing more than just naming people in the last 24 hours. They've started seizing super yachts. Now, this is the 512-foot yacht, the Dilbar. It's worth $600 million. It has the biggest swimming pool ever installed on a yacht, and it houses 96 staff. It's owned by Usmanov, the metals billionaire worth $20 billion. We know him in the UK because he owned a stake in Arsenal for many years. The EU says he's beloved by Putin and solves all of Putin's business deals. It's important to say Usmanov denies those close ties and says these sanctions are unfair and uncalled for, as do the other lists that are on the EU sanctions list. The other boat you were talking about, the other yacht, is owned by Igor Sechin. He's the Rosneft boss, the state-owned gas company, and people have described him as the de facto deputy to Putin. Of course, Fatima, we've got this whole situation now where we've got a regatta of super yachts that are making their way across international waters. Satellite pictures show them heading towards the Maldives in order to avoid sanctions. But it begs the question, what are we doing here in the UK? Because it's not just super yachts. Russian oligarchs own hundreds of millions of pounds worth of property here in the UK. We hear lots of information coming out about Michael Gove, apparently not just seizing property, but nationalising it. But all we seem to have done is signal to wealthy Russians to move their assets to safe havens.
Thanks very much, Helia. Now, aid agencies have launched a joint fundraising appeal to help the more than 1 million refugees fleeing from the Russian invasion. The Disasters Emergency Committee described the situation in Ukraine as one of the most heartbreaking they'd ever seen. Every pound donated will be matched by the government up to the value of £20 million. The family of Sarah Everard have paid tribute to her on the first anniversary of her abduction and murder by a police officer in South London. In a statement, they said they had been overwhelmed by the public's support. They said that their lives had been changed forever with the sadness of Sarah's loss, and that she was wonderful and that they miss her all the time. And people in Birmingham Erdington are voting today in a by-election triggered by the death of Labour frontbencher Jack Dromey. Mr Dromey held the seat at the last general election with a majority of 3,600 votes. A total of 12 candidates are standing, with polling stations open until 10 o'clock tonight.
Now, a quick recap of today's main news. Bombardments have continued in Kyiv and Kharkiv overnight. Kherson in the south is reported to have fallen under Russian control. The port city of Mariupol is said to be encircled, and in Odessa, Ukraine's third largest city on the Black Sea, an amphibious assault appears to be imminent. Ukraine's President Zelensky said nearly 9,000 Russian troops had been killed since the invasion began 8 days ago, although of course we cannot verify those figures. Just to put you into the picture, we're in Lviv in western Ukraine, where there is also nervousness about a possible future Russian attack, and of course thousands of people becoming refugees. We're back tomorrow at the earlier time of 11, 7 o'clock tonight, of course. Until then, that's Channel 4 News. Thanks for watching.